Welcome to An Author's Journey, where a prominent author chats with us about their journey as a writer. I'm your host, Joe Pizzo. Today's guest is Georgia Hurd, the NCTE 2023 Excellence in Poetry for Children Award winner. She received her MFA in poetry at Columbia University and is a founding member of the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project, where she coached teachers and students in the NYC public schools in writing and poetry. She has also given keynotes, workshops, and school visits around the US and in over 10 countries around the world. And currently, she presents school-wide workshops, keynotes, and staff development throughout the United States and internationally. In addition, Georgia gives online poetry writing workshops at the Poet Studio. George is the author of 20 books, including My Thoughts Are Clouds, Poems for Mindfulness, Boom, Bellow, Bleat, Animal Poems for Two or More Voices, and a forthcoming children's book, Welcome to the Wonder House, co-authored with Rebecca Kai Dontlich. She is also the author of numerous professional books on teaching writing and poetry, including Awakening the Heart, Exploring Poetry in Elementary and Middle School, which was cited by Instructor Magazine as one of the 10 books every teacher should read. That's pretty impressive. And Heart Maps, helping students create and craft authentic student writing, about which she was invited to give a TEDx talk entitled Mapping Your Heart. Her book of poems written during COVID, A Field Guide to the Heart, Poems of Love, Comfort, and Hope, co-authored with Rebecca Kai Dontlich, was published in 2021. Georgia lives on Singer Island in Florida with her family. You can follow her on her website at georgiahurd.com. Her Twitter and Instagram addresses are the same, at georgiahurd1, the number 1. Georgia Hurd, welcome. It is an honor to have you take an author's journey with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Joe. It's a joy to be speaking with you.
I'm going to jump right into this because I know everyone's excited to hear your responses. The blog produced by the Heinemann Publishing Company speaks of your use of heart maps and their connection to the challenges faced during the separation that resulted from the virtual and hybrid lessons brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. The blog states, quote, "Now more than ever, it is important that we create spaces for ourselves and our students to express feelings and process emotions. For decades, Georgia Hurd has guided students into more authentic writing experiences by using heart maps to explore what we all hold inside: feelings, passions, vulnerabilities, and wonderings," unquote. There is an interesting story behind the genesis of your heart maps. Would you kindly relate that story to us, Georgia?
Sure. I come from a family of cartographers. My cousins and sisters worked as map makers for the National Geographic Society when they first got out of college. So my grandmother wanted me to be a map maker too, but I wanted to be a writer and an educator. And so I got my MFA in poetry at Columbia University and started teaching writing in the New York City schools through the Teachers College Reading and Writing program. Years later, I was a visiting poet in a 4th grade classroom, and the children and I had a wonderful discussion about when we write our poems, that they come from our hearts. And they went back to write their poems, and they were all rhyming, and there were a lot of roses are red, violets are blues. And I asked myself, what happened to all those heartfelt ideas we talked about? And then I realized that they hadn't really read much poetry, and so they had a bit of a stereotype of what a poem was supposed to be. So the next day when I visited the class, we all sat on the rug together, and out of the blue, I'm sure my grandmother must have been channeling her energy, I made a big heart shape on a chart. And I said that poets write from what's stored in our hearts. And sometimes we need to map that out in order to know what we're going to write our poems about. So that's what they did. And their poems were transformed. And at that moment, I became a heartographer, a map maker of the heart, and I've been teaching heart maps ever since.
Now, in the aforementioned TEDx video, Mapping Your Heart, you explain that, quote, a heart map is a visual tool where we use writing and words and drawing to map what we care about and who we are, unquote. You add that your heart map is different every time you map your heart. You speak of heart maps including ordinary things and extraordinary things, changes that you wish to become, and many other issues that we can understand because, quote, the language of the heart is a common language that we all share, unquote. You advise the viewer that, quote, even if you don't consider yourself a writer, often the pulse and beat of a heart map can be transferred into poetry and prose, unquote. Georgia, could you explain a little bit to us about this process and how it works?
Well, I believe that when we discover what we love, what really matters to us, what we're passionate about, that this is the doorway into writing. And if we just tell the truth in our own words, then we have a poem. Rita Dove said that poetry is the genre of the inner life. And what better way to access that inner life than through a heart map?
Now, has there been any difference in using the heart maps to connect during the pandemic and now during our return to some degree of normalcy?
Well, I think the only difference between then and now might be the sense of urgency we felt during the pandemic. We were all scared and lonely and anxious. So, a heart map during that time helped people heal and connect and find the words to express that hurt. And now, although the pandemic has faded, there's still a lot of anxiety and fear and uncertainty, especially among young people. And depending on each person's experience and life, I think heart maps can help young people speak about their inner lives and help connect with their emotions even now. Also, I think it took a pandemic to help us realize that as educators, we have to tend to our students' hearts and their inner lives. And that learning involves caring, connection, and heart.
Now, what you say about the caring connection and heart is really important because we came through such a challenging time. And the challenge for those of us in the classroom is not to get lost in data gathering, but to use data gathering maybe to give us some insight into those areas that we need to address, but with a little bit more of the heart rather than completely with the mind in absence of the heart.
Beautifully said. Mhm.
Let me ask you, is there a difference in using the heart maps um, that you see maybe in just the last few months as we're sitting now through this period of the somewhat normalcy? Can you see a development continuing where the heart is becoming more and more emphasized?
I do. I think teachers, educators realize that without addressing the heart and students' emotions, that learning then becomes just a vessel. It becomes something that, and I think emotions really also are a motivator. So if a student feels connected in the classroom emotionally with her himself or with other people in the classroom or with the teacher, then I think that they're motivated to learn. So I think we've realized how important it is to not just address the content, but also the inner lives and emotions of our students. And I think that's where Heart Maps still has a sense of urgency in the classroom, even now.
You see these heart maps as being able to cross all cultures. And I'm wondering, would you encourage all classrooms in all curricula to use this technique with heart maps?
I do. I really do. I think they can be an essential tool in every classroom. And we have to give the students time to explore their heart maps, to share their heart maps, to connect with other people, uh, other students, with the teacher. And then I think that it makes it a meaningful, it's not just an activity, it's not just a one and done activity. It really is something that's very meaningful and can be very profound for so many students to just kind of explore memories, experiences, people they love, questions they have, and then to share that with a classroom community is I think one of the ways to build a very strong emotional caring community.
Now, I know that you use the heart maps with the students and have them write their own personal information on a heart map. Have you ever tried doing that where they maybe try to understand an historical event, or they try to understand a character in literature, or maybe even a friend by making a heart map for another person rather than for themselves?
Absolutely. I have a membership actually for heart maps, and those people who join the membership, I have 22 different heart maps. And one of the heart maps is a friendship heart map. I call it a circle of friends, where you just map out who are the people that you're connected to in school, out of school, and, friendship and connection with other people, that's so essential for all children, all students. And we don't spend that much time talking about that. And how do you make a friend? What happens when you lose a friend? What happens when a friend moves away? I mean, there's so much emotion connected, I think, with friendship and with the people that we connect to in school and out of school. So that's one of the heart maps. Another heart map is I belong heart map. Where do you feel you belong the most? What circumstances in school, out of school, with what people? So there's lots of different ways to focus a heart map so that, and I also, as you said, you can also explore a heart map in terms of if you love a book, and you fall in love with a character in a book. Usually it's because somehow we either learn something about ourselves, we learn something different about that character, we get to know that character like a friend. So to make a heart map of that book you're reading, that character, how it relates to you, what came up for you, what memories did it bring up, how do you relate to this, I think is such a powerful way to talk about books and literature.
It seems that it recognizes the importance of emotion along with reason, that reason without emotion would seem almost cold and impersonal. But when the heart element is introduced, when the emotion is introduced, that there not only is a balance, but there seems to be a synergy as well.
I agree. I think that that's so true. And I think that, when we ask kids to write book reviews, to start off first with the heart map and really what are the emotional connections you feel. And then you can weave everything that you've put in your heart map into some kind of, review or presentation.
Let me ask you then, if we were to be able to pause this interview and give you time to create a heart map right at the present time, what would it include?
Well, I made a heart map yesterday.
Okay.
And I was surprised at how much of my heart map consisted of the observations I have when I take my daily walk, or when I try to take a daily walk, especially this time of year when birds are serenading us and the light is changing a little bit into spring. It's misty and pastel colored. So I'm very, very attuned to my environment. So that's always on my heart map. But I always have consistent entries about my family, and they appear in different forms. So sometimes I draw hearts to represent them. Sometimes I write about a particular memory, or I'll write down a conversation, a piece of dialogue. So recently my mother's 95, and I just went up to celebrate her birthday with her. So that was part of my heart map yesterday, is talking about being with her and the conversations I had with her and asking her questions. So it changes because life changes. So every time I do a heart map, it's always different, but I do have some consistent pieces to it or entries on it.
I like the point about the change and how our lives change and our situations change, because that's something to me that we as educators are very aware of, and that the most effective teachers are the ones who can read the pulse in the room. They can check the temperature. They can adjust the climate and address whatever that culture happens to be, and really weave the skills by supporting them with the heart, by supporting them with the emotional aspect. If I've said to my students often, if you learn all the facts, but you don't feel good about learning all the facts, you probably won't remember them. And if you do it, it will be for all the wrong reasons. But if you find that unique situation where there's a teacher who actually cares, you'll probably remember things that you didn't even realize you were remembering, because there's a connection. It's a synergy rather than an energy.
That's so true. And I have a heart map that sometimes we do called the Tender Loving Care Heart Map. And if somebody is having a hard time in the classroom, that's something that we can, one person or I could do it, just really map out what we love about the person, how we feel connected, what we notice about the person, positive traits, so that we can actually give that heart map to another student. So I think that connection is everything. A caring environment is really everything in the classroom.
Now back to the Heinemann blog, because there was a lot of good information on there. You pay tribute to Stanley Kunitz as someone who has changed your life. He was your writing teacher when you were a student at Columbia. And he told you during your first writing conference that you should write about what's really going on in your life and to tell the truth. Now, you feel that this advice has changed the way you write, the way you talk to kids about writing, and it made you believe that you have a voice and can be a writer. You say that you try to do the same thing when you talk to kids about their own writing. Do you find that students receive your advice the same way that you accepted the advice from your professor?
I do. I think kids respond to authenticity. So that, I really believe that children are natural poets and they speak what's on their hearts and minds in a language that's direct and authentic. And I think when we try to pretend it using words that are large or fancy, or we try to write in, fancy forms, although forms are wonderful. But I think when we try on things that feel like we're pretending, I think that's when the poetry comes out that feels a little doggerel, that doesn't feel like it really connects with people. So when I have a writing conference with a young poet, I often ask, you know, tell me more. What do you see in your mind? How did you feel? I just open it up and they begin talking. And oftentimes I just write down what they say and read it back to them. And they're so surprised that that's the poem right there, just what they said. So I do believe that. I think that that advice has really helped me in my writing, but also in my teaching. And sometimes adults have a more difficult time, right? Because we have a harder time being vulnerable, and that's what was happening to me. And Stanley Kunitz recognized that, and just it was like cold water on my face, and it felt like this is what I needed to hear, that it's okay to be yourself, to be authentic, to speak in the language that is yours and use those words that you naturally would.
Now, you're making me think of ChatGPT and the artificial intelligence argument, because uh, you can basically have a poem, a story, a term paper written for you using artificial intelligence. But the thing that seems to be missing is the heart.
Hmm.
That formulas and checklists are fine if you're looking for something reflecting formulas and checklists. But as soon as you'd like that unique perspective, you'd like that bit of creativity that goes outside the box, artificial intelligence seems to be trapped within a box where it can't get itself outside of that box. And I think what you're doing with the heart maps is giving students an opportunity to go outside of that box, to go beyond what the normal routine is, and be even more intelligent and more heartfelt by being more intelligent and heartfelt than what they might be had they just followed the algorithms of artificial intelligence.
I think it would be interesting to ask the chat bot if it could make a heart map. I wonder what it would do and
Yeah.
what would be on that heart map. It would be very interesting to see, the one I forgot what it's called, but the one that has a that replicates images even. But I think, there was a something I think I read in a newspaper article that showed a chatbot poem and a child's poem, and it had they were side by side, and people couldn't tell the difference. Well, if you're a poet and a teacher, you can tell the difference.
Yes.
You know that there's something about the vulnerability in the way that children use language that a chatbot would never do. I was in a classroom once teaching, and a girl wrote about clouds, and she called them the glory clouds. Now, chatbot would call them glorious because that's grammatically correct. And that's what happened. The teacher came up to the student and had her correct it and crossed out glory and put glorious. And the next week I came back and I said, "What happened to the glory cloud?" That was such a fresh and interesting way of describing the cloud. She said, "My teacher said it was wrong." And I thought, that's the thing about poetry is that we take language and we use it in ways that are unexpected. And that's the beauty of poetry. And a chatbot, I don't think can do that.
No, it doesn't seem able to. And that's the uniqueness that poetry brings. And I think what you're saying is that there's a lesson to be learned in all this, that the heart and its emotional aspects does not follow a set formula. There is no algorithm, there is no trigonometric function to reflect what goes on. There are rules that are broken purposefully rather than followed historically.
Exactly. And intuitively, that,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's very well said.
Let me ask you, do you see poetry as something that will drive other forms of writing as well?
I do. I feel that so much, it's easier to write a 10 line, 20 line poem. It's more manageable, but it still can contain complex ideas and emotions. So I think for so many students, it is the doorway into literacy for so many kids. And because if you find success writing a poem, then you can take all of some of the, or all of the craft tools really that you learn in poetry and apply them to prose. And that's why Grace Paley said, "I went to the school of poetry in order to learn how to write prose." So, if you think about what is the school of poetry and what does it teach it so many things: craft, selecting words, tone, music, pace, and also the authentic process of writing and then revising. So, yeah, I think that poetry can be a teacher for other genres of writing.
When teachers are teaching poetry to their students, should they be writing along with them or at least be those who do write poetry?
I do think that because when teachers write alongside students, they get an inside look into what they're asking their students to do. And also, it's a way to know what craft tools are we going to teach? What process advice can I give my students based on my own experiences? And also, it takes away the fear and intimidation that some educators feel about poetry, and it makes us vulnerable as well as our students. So we're kind of in the same place, and then we can have a conversation about it. I always, when teachers say that they're afraid of teaching poetry, I'll say just be a learner, learn alongside your students, and that's the best way to approach teaching poetry.
For those folks who are afraid of teaching poetry, would you advise them to begin with a formula and then break away, or go right to your heart first and start putting emotions and observations on paper?
I think the latter. I think that they need to start with the experience of what it's like to explore a topic, to run with it, to just put down, whatever's on your heart about it. And then you can get out the craft toolboxes and you can learn about line breaks and stanzas and cutting out, unnecessary words and making metaphor and beginnings and endings. You can do all that if you have kind of the experience of writing a poem. The craft tools, remember, are just in the service of the heart. But if you don't have the heart, then you don't have a poem. You have the craft tools, but that doesn't make poetry. So I always begin not with a formula at all. I think forms are wonderful and I teach them all the time, but I don't start that way. I usually end up that way. When kids love poetry, and they love to know that there's such thing as a tanka or a haiku, or even for older students, a villanelle that's really about being obsessed about something, right? Love or grief or whatever it is. So each form that we teach has usually an emotional meaning behind it. And so if we understand that, then it becomes part of a whole kind of package that we teach throughout the year.
I had a student bring a piece of writing to me this week, and I read his piece of writing and I said, you know what? This sounds like it has the elements of rap in it. And he
Right.
said, well, what do you mean? And so I read the first two lines of it with a rap beat. And I said, do you hear it? And he said, yeah, I do. I said, well, take your poem now and try to move it into that musical realm, because there's more to it than you actually intended when you first began. And it may be more successful as a rap than it is even as a poem.
I love how you connected with that student. That student will remember that forever because you recognize something that he was trying to do, like the little tiny, seed of it, and you gave him permission to explore that. And that's, I think, another way that you're right. That's how forms evolve in poetry. Yeah.
I think that's the beauty of what you do, because I've read your work and I've followed you for a while. And I know that when you work with students, it's not checklist, fill in the box, fill in the blank. Here are the 10 poetic terms. Make sure you put three into this poem. It's right from what you feel and what you see and what you hear. Use the senses, use your confidence, but also use your reluctance.
Hmm.
Balance the two of them and let them both drive your poem. It doesn't have to be something that seems to be the strongest and most powerful piece of literature that you're writing. It might be something where it shows where you're at that point, and it might be in a state of confusion or in a state of need where you didn't even realize that that happened, and it becomes therapeutic.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And I think that if teachers took every single craft tool, like a metaphor and simile, rather than having it on a checklist, and if you think about how profound it is to make an imaginative leap from the sky to, I don't know, as one first grader said, an angel's pool or whatever it is, to make that leap, that really is transforming. And so each one of the tools that poets use is as profound. And so I try to teach it that way so that usually kids do it naturally. I mean, young kids are experts at metaphor and simile. They don't know the name of it. And I use a lot of their work then to read it back to all the other students, and they're amazed at what they do naturally. So,
I can't agree with you more. The whole idea of sound just driving that lesson is critical. I do an exercise with my students where I tell them come up with the most creative excuse you can for not being able to go to school that day, and be as wild out of the box as you can, of course, being school appropriate, and give me whatever's inside. And they come up with some of the craziest things. What I do is I have them all stand up and I point to them. And as I'm pointing to them, they give me their line, but I'll hear a line that goes with another line and I'll put those two together or bounce back and forth and say, we just did a poetry slam. And what you did is you heard the connection between those lines. And that's why I kept coming back. And when I ended, I might have gone to one person 4 consecutive times and just kept pointing at them. And they gave the line, gave the line, gave the line, gave the line. And I said, you can hear that rhythm. That's what the language does. So you say how poetry crosses over into prose. Yes, it does. It does very strongly. And I thank you for carrying that message out to teachers everywhere.
well, I love that. I love the lesson you just described. That is wonderful. Your students must love that you connect with them in that way. And yeah, that's beautiful. I love that.
I'm very fortunate. I get sent the best students every year,
Yeah.
and every one of them is gifted. Let me ask you another question now. Is there a poet who was your favorite when you were growing up?
That's such a good question. We didn't read poetry when I grew up.
Yeah,
My mother used to say these wonderful little weather rhymes. Remember that? Red in the morning, a sailor's warning, red at night, a sailor's delight. And she had
right.
a whole bunch of them. There was a whole repertoire. And I used to love that as well as nursery rhymes. She would recite those. And I guess that is poetry. It's just that we never really read poetry from a book. And I think because that connection with the real world and weather and my mother's voice, I fell in love with poetry then. But I never knew that you could actually be a poet. I thought that they were all not alive, just in books. So it was a revelation to realize that, oh, you can actually be a poet on this planet, and it's a wonderful job, the best job on earth.
Who are your go-to poets today?
Oh, I have so many. I love, there's a poet called Ilya Kaminsky. It's an adult poet. Another one called Anif Abdurraqib. And then there's always James Wright, Mary Oliver, and then for children, Nikki Grimes and Joyce Sidman and Kwame Alexander. There's so many now, and there's so many new poets that I create anthologies, and I'm just meeting a whole bunch of new poets that have become my new poet friends. So there's wonderful work out there.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you've given a lot of keynotes and workshops, and you do school visits around the US and in over 10 countries around the world. Currently, you're presenting school-wide workshops, keynotes, and staff development throughout the US and internationally, and you're giving online poetry writing workshops at the Poet Studio. So you must be really busy.
I am really busy, but I'm doing what I love.
Yeah. And that's the whole key. If you do what you love, you never work a single day. When
True,
you don't do what you love, it's misery. It's absolute misery.
true.
Now, how has the aftermath of COVID-19 affected these activities in terms of the content you cover and maybe the availability that was there before we started with restrictions, and even now we're having different variants spreading and fighting those off?
Yeah, it's a very uncertain time. And I mentioned before that I'm leaving on Friday to go teach in a wonderful little school in Bangkok. and I was there right before COVID. And this is my first international trip that I've taken, so I'm very excited. And I'm going to be there for 3 weeks teaching. So I still teach in schools, but there's a lot more happening now online. And one of the reasons I love online is that you can, instead of coming for 2 days to a school in the United States, you can, spread those 2 days out, and you can spread it over, 3 weeks if it's just a couple of periods a day, so that I really get to know the kids and their writing, and there's a consistency that happens from the first day all the way to the last day where we usually have a celebration. So although I miss sitting down on the rug with kids and talking to them one on one, in some ways that time with them, that kind of long lingering time. And in some schools, they actually have a separate computer set up, so I can actually have a conference with the student
Nice.
in like a little kind of a library room off of the classroom if they want a
Uh-huh.
conference. So that's, we've all adapted, and who knows what the future holds. But thank goodness, right? We've all adapted, and we're able to teach what we love, even with COVID, with the uncertainties that are happening now.
Now, what's your favorite book of all time and your favorite poem of all time?
That is such a good question. It changes for me, and um, the contemporary novel, I love listening and reading novels, and one of them was fairly recent one was called All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr.
Okay.
And it's really about seeing the world via touch and so much more. It's a kind of a historical novel as well. I'm now reading a contemporary book of poetry anthology called Poetry Unbound: 50 Poems to Open Your World. And it's collected by an Irish poet named Padraig O'Tuama. And these poems are international, and he presents the poem, and then he gives a very brief explanation and kind of description of the poem. And it's also a podcast. So I love that. I love learning about different poets all over the world. So I have so many books that are my favorites.
Now, when you have some downtime, what do you do to relax?
I go for walks. I observe, I listen. Sometimes I listen to books. I like to clear my head. I like to get out and just clear my head, and just listen to the world.
And how does that affect your writing?
It's that heart map that we're constantly creating, right? We're
Wow.
always storing whatever we have a map. I have a map of every walk I take. I have a map of, the last year in my heart. And when I create the heart map, then I can access it. And it doesn't have to be big things. These are the small things that you notice, that we store in our hearts. So all of that makes it, not all of that, but a lot of it makes it into my poetry because it's something that I love and it matters to me.
Do you find that you have to deal with writer's block, or are you one of those writers who has ways to overcome it?
Writer's block for me, it doesn't really occur anymore because I'm usually working on a longer project. And when I have a collection I'm working on, one poem inspires another, and it feels like I'm always thinking about it. So writer's block doesn't happen in that way. The only time I don't really write poetry is when I'm writing prose. When I'm writing prose, then my poetry goes into hiding a little bit. It feels a little bit different, the process, but it's still there. And it's not blocked. It's just quiet for the moment and letting another voice come out.
See, I like that. The fact that you refer to it as being quiet rather than a block, because quiet is easier to deal with. A block is a challenge and one that sometimes can't be overcome. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that.
Thank you.
Now, what advice would you give a neophyte poet who might want to write poetry that reflects the essence of their heart and soul?
I would say keep a notebook with you and write down whatever fragments, words, thoughts, memories that come to you during the day. And don't look at them for a week or two. Just put down the fragments, a word, a thought, a dialogue, overheard dialogue. Then go back after about 2 weeks and reread and try to gather some of those fragments into poems. Try to make those connections as you do with your students. And I think, of course, reading a poem every day, there's a lot of poems on the internet now, to be inspired by other voices. That's what I would advise. Just keep a notebook, and it's not something you have to sit down every day and write for 15 minutes. It's just keep it with you so that when that moment, when that feeling comes, when you feel that tug on your heart, you have something to write it down on.
Now, if you were given the opportunity to take your life in a completely different direction, where might that lead you?
I truly believe that my life was meant to be, but, and so I think I was guided. I don't know how I was guided into this journey, but it feels like there was a map that both I made and the universe made together. But I love art and painting, and I think that I would take more time to pick up my paintbrushes, and there's still time to do that, but I think I would do that. I would be an artist as well.
And it's funny you say map because we mentioned the cartography background in your family at the beginning of the interview.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, I would not be a cartographer, but I would be a heartographer, like I knew I would be somehow.
I like that. Now, is there a message that you'd like to leave your fellow writers with today?
I believe that everyone has poetry inside of them, and that the only difference between poets and people who don't write poetry is trust. You just have to believe that your life, your soul depends upon it, and that the world needs your words.
Would you like to give us, once again, I mentioned them up front, the ways to contact you, the ways to follow you?
Sure. Well, I have a website, so that's georgiaherd.com. But I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Georgia Herd, the number one, Georgia Herd one. And then I'm also on Facebook under my name. I have a Facebook page as well. So I'd love to hear from anybody. And I hear from lots of poets and teachers who send me heart maps and poems. And I love being connected in that way.
Georgia Hurd, it has been an absolute delight to take an author's journey with you today. Your enthusiasm, energy, and appreciation of the nuances of the poetic process are indeed admirable. I'm sure that you have inspired many of our listeners to reach for a paper and some colored pens or pencils to begin work on their own personal heart map as we speak. I'm also sure that there will be many classrooms in which heart maps become a staple of our instructional process.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joe. I've loved talking with you. And thank you for your thoughtful questions and also for all you do to inspire poetry.
George, it's folks like you who give me that impetus. I see you in action and I'm just in awe. And I hope that someday I can be as effective as you are.
Thank you. You're very kind and very humble.
Well, that concludes our journey for this day. Be sure to tune in again and join me for more conversations with more authors of interest. For an author's journey, I'm your host, Joe Pizzo. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.